Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I am Auron MacIntyre. Identity. Discussion of it is basically forbidden, right? It's something that's very touchy. It's something that everyone is incredibly on eggshells about. We've seen the left pushing its identity politics, and so there's obviously a very toxic version of identity that can completely railroad your civilization and make it impossible to function. If you're too obsessed with identity, then you end up in horrible places. But there's also another side of this, right? If you completely ignore identity, which unfortunately much of the right has done for a long time because of basically the threats that the left has thrown out, bigot, racist, xenophobe, all this stuff. If you discuss any of that on the right, you were always torn down. And so the right has studiously avoided conversations about this topic too. And obviously we want to avoid the extremes of the left, but the only way to really avoid them is to provide a healthy understanding of identity. Without a healthy understanding, the toxic versions that the left have will eventually go ahead and impose themselves on what is happening. There is no such thing as a void of identity. It will be filled by something. And so it's better that we have a healthy, holistic, organic understanding than if we have a artificial cudgel that the left is using to really beat the right and the rest of the United States into line with. That said, a lot of countries, now that some of the progressive hegemony has broken, especially in the United States, are struggling with this idea of identity. There are a lot of people asking deeper questions about what identity is, much to the horror of those who have tried to kind of bury these questions. Again, it would be easier to just not talk about them at all. That's certainly the safest path and the one that the right has taken for a very long time. But that's also for the cowards, which is why we're not going to do that. We're going to have discussions on what this means. What's the best way to manifest this? How do we understand this in a way that allows us to answer critical questions while not becoming obsessed with them to the point where it makes it impossible for us to function as a society? And so in a step of doing this is going to be the need to address what actually constitutes an identity, right? So immediately when we look at the notion of identity, several things underlie it, right? A lot of people will point to currently the idea of religion or values, some kind of ideology. Well, we have a shared ideology and that's what drives it. Some people will look at older definitions, traditions, folkways, heritage. These things are all going to be critical. They're going to be tied in. The problem with the modern understanding is that it tends to be so incredibly ideological. And we see this kind of permeate the American discussion when it comes to the idea of the propositional nation, right? Now, I've already written against the propositional nation. I've explained some of the core problems with the propositional nation. So that's not going to be the entire thrust of this episode. But we do have to understand that the completely propositional nation is a problem, an abstraction for a lot of reasons. Not least of which is that while many people try to apply it in the American context, and it feels like there's a more robust argument for identity in the propositional nation when it comes to America, because America was a new world nation, not an old world nation, right? And many people had to come from Europe, especially, mostly European descent, coming over initially, settling America, defining its identity and its understanding. But it was always a mixture, right? It was mostly Anglo, but there was always another admixture of others coming in mostly from Europe. But then you added waves of Irish and German immigration and Eastern European immigration outside of Europe. And so over time, people built up this idea of the propositional nation, that there's some kind of general ideological understanding that underpins the American experiment. The problem is, and I don't think that even really works in the American context, but the problem is that they continued to apply this. And now at this point, you see the same debate happening in places that were always, European. You look to countries like England or Scotland or Ireland, places where obviously ethnic Europeans originated. And even in those lands, we see a discussion about where identity is not tied to your being European in any significant sense. Your ethnicity should not be a factor. There was recently a clash, ironically, on the Trigonometry podcast that was kind of interesting, right? You have the Konstantin Kisin, who's one of the guys who kind of promoted this idea of the woke right, that the new right is too worried about identity or any of these things, and you can't touch any of those subjects, and so he really kind of pushed that initially. But it seems like he might have shifted some, or at the very least, he got into a altercation, an exchange that puts him on a different side of this. He was discussing this issue with Fraser Nelson, who's I believe a Times columnist over in the UK, and they were having this discussion, and Nelson basically says, "Oh well, of course Rishi Sunak, who was the Conservative Prime Minister at one point, or the leader of the Conservative Party," and he says, well, obviously, he is English. And Konstantin Kisin says, well, he's British. He's joined kind of this larger ideological identity of Britain. But this guy is and this was Konstantin's words, not mine. He said, this is a brown Hindu. Like, this is a guy from India. He doesn't have the religion of the UK. He doesn't have the ethnicity of England. He's obviously not English. Maybe there's some larger abstraction where he's British, but he is most certainly not English. And this was some huge controversy. There was a big blow up over pointing out the fact that a man who had a different religion, an entirely different racial background and origin, could not be of the English ethnicity. And actually Nelson said, well, English isn't even an ethnicity at all. Right. It doesn't even exist if you're looking at, this identity. And that's an incredible admission. I think that we've taken this notion of the propositional nation and we've applied this to basically everything. Like, every Western nation has now become propositional. The original argument was that this was unique to America. This was about the American identity as a new world nation. It was something that was originally a compilation of different European ethnicities and then expanded that experiment beyond Europe. And that's what made it, again, singular, very different from the nature of other nations. Again, I don't exactly buy that, but even if you buy into that formula, it's really hard, if you're a propositional nation guy, to look at something like England and say, oh, well, no, this is also a propositional nation. And yet that's what's being asserted, right? And it's being asserted because the way in which all of our governments are run and the way that the liberal ideology has been extracted demands that there be no closed identities, right? That there can be no definite identities. Everything needs to be interchangeable. Everybody needs to be an interchangeable widget, a cog. There are no particular peoples that have specific ways of being, understandings, personalities, beliefs. That everything is accessible to everyone. It's truly global. It's globalism in the realist sense. And so for globalism to continue to exist, you have to basically demolish all identity, even the most obviously correct ethnic understanding of a European nation. You can't have any ethnic European identity. There is no native European, even though that can't possibly be true. But the ideology must destroy all of those things, right? And so that's why Konstantin Kisin, who himself has already kind of criticized a lot of people when it comes to the woke right and identity and all these things, himself said, no, that's a brown Hindu. He can't be English. Now, that doesn't jive with some of Konstantin's other rhetoric, but ultimately it's obviously correct. Like that's a easy distinction to make. You only need two eyeballs to really draw that conclusion. But it's something that he would have recoiled with if it had probably come out of the mouth of someone else. To his credit, he's embraced this distinction. He's and I met Konstantin at the ARC conference. He was very cordial. We got along just fine. He took the time to talk to me. We didn't hash everything out, but I'd just like to say before we get in this is not me just doing a general hit on him. We've had our disagreements, but he was reasonable when we had a discussion together, and that so points in his column for that. And here he seems to, even if he hasn't worked out the ideological implications of what he's saying, he seems to be acknowledging these differences. He even said himself, "Look, I'm Ukrainian and Russian. or my child is Ukrainian and Russian. It comes from parents that are Ukrainian and Russian. Yes, I've been here in England for a very long time. I consider myself British in this like overarching ideological extracted sense, but I'm obviously not English, and I'm never going to be English, and my child isn't English. And that was, a relatively honest thing for him to say. Same thing came from Suella Braverman, who's a conservative MP in England. And she wrote an article that went out in the Telegraph and said, look, I'm not English. I know I'm not English. I'm never going to be English. That's not what English means. And so there's a very interesting thing. Again, in America, discussions of ethnicity are particularly touchy because we're not supposed to believe there is an American ethnicity at the core. But you can't make that argument in England, at least not without being deeply dishonest. And so many people on the right in England are having to deal with this in a way that the right in America is not, because Americans just kind of do this, lame pivot of like, well, it's not a real thing. We don't really have a thing. We're special. We're different. We're not like England. We're so propositional. But you can't do that in England because it is a real ethnicity. There's a native European population that originates from that region. You can't make these same arguments. And so people like Suella Braverman are having to say, like, look, there's obviously a real English ethnicity. Now, we can have a larger discussion, and we will have a larger discussion today on whether there's a British abstracted identity. But that very fact that they have to make a stand on the reality of that ethnic group is actually really important because let's just be frank here. There's a general need to paint white societies as not being native, as not being an ethnicity, as not being real in the sense that other societies are. There's a very, very big push to basically try to dismantle it. It's been more successful in the United States, again, because of the nature of the United States and the way that it was founded. But they are trying to pull the same thing in countries like the United Kingdom. And there is some pushback here, which is a really interesting thing to see, because I don't think you would have even seen this acknowledgement just say 10 years ago. All right. So why the Ship of Theseus? Why do I got this ship up here? What does that have to do with anything? All right. So for people who are unaware, the Ship of Theseus is a classic philosophical problem, right? It's a classic philosophical thought experiment. And in the Ship of Theseus, and it's been brought up all over the place, but in the Ship of Theseus, basically what you're addressing is the metaphysics of identity. What makes us who we are, right? What is an identity? Is it just the physical structure of something? Is there an abstract metaphysical identity that rests on the physical structure? Is it the form and not so much the material that matters? Aristotle's different causes, right? Like where does identity actually lie? And so the again, for those who are not familiar, the basic formulation of the Ship of Theseus is you have the ship, and over time, obviously, any ship is going to wear, right? It's going to go into battle. It's going to be on the sea, wear and tear. You're going to have to replace things. You're going to have to repair things. And when you do, you're obviously changing something about the ship. If I've got a ship in the harbor and, 7 boards have rotted out, I need to change those 7 boards for the ship to continue to function and be a ship. But when I've changed those boards, have I changed the identity of the ship? Most people would say no, right? I'm making repairs, but the Ship of Theseus is still the Ship of Theseus. Well, over time, I'm obviously going to change every board, right? If the ship continues to serve long enough, eventually I'll swap up every single piece of the ship. So once I've changed the very last board, the board that was never in the ship in the first place, have I replaced the Ship of Theseus? Now, some people will say, yes, the entire material base of the ship has changed, and therefore it is a new ship. Once you've gotten rid of the last piece of the ship that was the original Ship of Theseus, you have fundamentally changed what the ship is. More people will say, well, no, because the ship was changed slowly. And so it's the form of the ship that matters, right? It's not the matter itself, not the particular board. No one board was the Ship of Theseus by itself, but it was the form of the ship that mattered. And so as long as the form of the ship continues to stay the same, even if you change out the pieces of that ship, you still have the ship of Theseus. Others will say, no, it's the ownership, right? It's the fact that Theseus owned the ship that makes it the ship of Theseus. And so as long as Theseus continues to own the ship, even if the form or the material of the ship changes, it is therefore the ship of Theseus. Others will say, actually, no. Once you change the form, it doesn't matter who the owner is, the ship itself has changed. Or once you change the material, the ship has changed. You can see there's a lot of answers to this question. And generally, as with so many philosophical questions, most people say there isn't a right answer to this question. It's a thought experience, a way for you to think deeply about how things change over time. So what I want to do today is take this thought experiment and apply it to nations, right? What is a nation? What is an identity of a nation? What makes it a nation? And if that nation changes over time, does it retain the same identity? Does it stay the ship of Theseus? Is it still the United Kingdom if you replace the people of the United Kingdom? Is it still the United States if you replace the religion of the United States? Can you keep the form? Can you keep the ownership of, the state apparatus but change everything else about those places and still have them be the same thing? What actually constitutes the identity of these places? So first, I'd like to say that it's important to recognize that no civilization stays the same. And this is going to be the part that's going to anger some people who are very, very, very tied to, I guess, what one would call the blood and soil idea of nationalism, the pure, genetic descent idea of nationalism, that a nation is just its genes being passed down, biological reduction. I would say that obviously no organism stays the same its whole life, right? You have, you yourself are a human being that is regenerating different cells. You're sloughing off these cells. You're changing the raw material of your body the whole time. And so in a very direct physical sense, we recognize that nothing that is living, nothing that is thriving is ever staying exactly the same. No matter how much we want to conserve a good portion of who we are and our identity, all identities that are alive, that are real, that aren't dead on a page somewhere are changing. And so when we're to discuss national identity, that's going to be true as well, right? No nation is going to 100% be exactly what it was throughout its history. It has to change if it's going to be alive at all. Morphology, life cycles involve change. And this is as true for nations as it is for individual entities, individual beings, right? So no nation is going to stay exactly the same. Before we go any further, we need to probably also clarify what we mean by nation. This is a huge problem. I've gotten this before when I've discussed the propositional nation and other issues. However, it's worth reiterating just so people don't get confused with definitions here. A nation is a people, right? And a nation and a people are a mix of factors, right? One is heritage, but others are tradition, language, culture, folkways, religion. These things are all things that make up our identities as nations. Nations are distinct from states or countries. We use them as synonyms, right? The nation state is a relatively new formulation of the way we understand national identity when we decided that nations and states should be coterminous, right? That these things should begin and end together, that nations should govern themselves, peoples should govern themselves. That was an idea that existed, that took shape, and a lot of people have now conflated the idea of state and nation, but they're not the same thing. Throughout most of history, nations, peoples, were ruled by states, countries, that were different than just the nation itself. Some nations were states. In fact, in some cases, in a lot of cases throughout history, the city was the state, right? A nation could not be beyond its own city. So the peoples of Athens were very different from the peoples of Sparta, though together they understood some kind of shared Hellenic identity that made them different than, say, the Persians, right? So there's levels of identity, but nationhood was something that was buried deep in. Peoplehood was buried deep in, all the way down to often the family, tribe, or city level. It couldn't even be extended out to Greece as an identity. Greece as an identity was something of a superstructure on top of these smaller identities of nationhoods, right? So we want to make it clear when we're discussing the identity of nations, we don't mean the same thing as just having the government, right? And that's going to be important because right now, most people think of the government as the nation. A nation is an area, a geographical area that is governed by a specific entity. So if you're in the geographic area, you're of the nation. And if you're not in the geographic area, you're not of the nation. Of course, that's wildly incorrect. That is not how that works. But that is unfortunately the identity that has been understood by many people. And this is kind of the form argument, right? As long as whatever stays in this form, we have the form of the United States, we have the form of the UK. So if you're in this form anywhere, you are of that form, right? That's how it works. But that's not actually how, again, identity has worked through most of history. And so that is an easy point that gets confused. So the Ship of Theseus here, again, back to our original understanding, the argument is often that there's purely like the kind of this genetic material lineage that creates the identity of a nation. Now, I'm not going to completely discount that. Like the heritage is a significant part of nationhood, of ethnicity, right? That doesn't disappear because it makes people uncomfortable. That said, if you read perennial traditionalists, if you go back and read Oswald Spengler, and I've only read one book by Julius Evola, but I'm told that he also held a similar disdain. But both Spengler and Evola have a disdain for pure genetic determinism. Pure genetic understanding of peoplehood was for them an abomination. It was a perversion because peoplehood was something that was much more spiritually and culturally entwined as well. They would never have denied that heritage played a key role in this, but it would not have been the only factor. And this is important when we look at history throughout the world, right? Most societies, not all, there are many societies that are more closed, right? But especially in Western societies, there's always been a certain understanding of a little bit of permeability in the membrane of national identity. You couldn't completely swap out half the nation and the people tied to the heritage and have the same nation. They understood that. But there was always an ability for people to enter in, and after existing in that nation for a long time, there would be some kind of blending that would continue the identity of the nation, but incorporate those that have joined it. Now, I want to be clear, this was radically different from our understanding today. Today, we're like, oh, well, if you crossed into a country and you've been around for 5 years, you're part of the nation. You're just as American as somebody who was born here and their family has been here for hundreds of years. You're just as British as somebody. No, that was never the understanding throughout most of history. Real assimilation, real joining, real weaving of peoples together to continue the nation was always a generational project, right? And this is part of the argument that people will make with the Ship of Theseus, right? If you came in and switched out 75% of the boards of the Ship of Theseus, it would not be the Ship of Theseus. Pretty much everyone recognizes that. That very few people have that answer to the question. The answer that most people have is one of continuity. The Ship of Theseus maintains its identity as long as the parts being swapped in are relatively congruous with those that have already existed. And you can kind of shift over time the identity slightly without losing the entire understanding of what the Ship of Theseus is. And most people have this understanding of nationhood as well. At least they did throughout most of history. That peoples could become one, that there could be a weaving in of individuals who joined the group, but this was a multi-generational project. It's not that you would be Greek or you would be American or that you would be British, but your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren or your great-great-grandchildren, but once they have intermarried, once they have been completely immersed in the culture, once they have adopted the religion and the traditions, once the act of existing in that society is as much a part of them, breathing air, as anything else, that is when they would have adopted this identity. That's how they would maintain the Ship of Theseus, even if you've switched out different parts and different boards. All right, that said, there's an important distinction here, right? A lot of people will look at the body example, my cells are replacing themselves, so am I still the same person? And they'll say yes, and if you try to get them to a materialistic cause, they'll say, oh, well, my genetic code is perpetuating itself. Yes, there's different cells, but I am still me because the same DNA is replicating itself, and I'm still being, the person that I was previously, and so there's this level of continuity. And they'll probably look at the nation and say the same thing. Look, there has to be heritage, or you're just not perpetuating the identity of the nation. And there's a lot of truth to that. There is a percentage of change that can occur while you retain your identity, but you can't turn over the whole thing, and you especially can't do it rapidly, or it will fundamentally have to change the identity. Now, the reason this becomes important is there are a couple of debates happening simultaneously. Again, we look at the British example. There are a large amount of what they call Asian over there. In the United States, Asian means Far East, Japanese, Chinese, Taiwanese, Vietnamese. Like these are Asian people. But in the European context, Asian is anyone on the continent of Asia, which is reasonable. But they often mean Pakistani or Indian extraction. Right. And so when they're talking about Asian men, that's what they mean, or Asian women. And so when you look at their kind of grappling with this issue, they're trying to say, okay, well, a lot of, for instance, Indian colonials coming over are British in the sense that the British occupied India. Their culture, permeated a large amount of Indian culture. A lot of them came over and have lived in the UK for a long time, or their entire lives, or even multiple generations. And so there's a level of Britishness there because they've adopted so much of that culture. But when you get down to the ethnicity, are they English, right? That was the debate that was going on. Like, can you be English and maintain, while having, this different ethnic background? And the answer for many people, even, people on, these public talk shows like Suella Braverman or Constant Kissin, is no. You can't be English and have this different ethnic background. Maybe British is this cultural abstraction we can all join, but English is not, right? And so then there becomes an important question. Where does Britishness come from, right? Let's assume for a moment that Britishness and Englishness are separate things. Now, to some extent, that has to be true because you can't have the Scottish and the Irish and the Welsh all together without having some kind of other identity. And this is usually what's meant, right? English is specifically England, and then you have the wider British identity, which is the British Isles, all these different cultures and kingdoms that eventually came under one state rule, right? So there's an argument for the British-English distinction in that sense. But that personality has to come from somewhere, right? And we can see the problem with this attempt at abstraction when we look at, say, the trans debate, right? Because people will look at what is male and what is female. And biological essentialists, as most of us are when it comes to actual sex, say, no, what is male and female comes from specific biological hardwiring, right? It's different. It's different at a very real level. You can't just adopt different aspects of this. But people who want to muddy these waters tend to abstract it out to gender, right? So it's not sexual biology, it's gender. And gender is the expression of these things. So they try to separate out, right? It's an abstraction between gendered behaviors and biological essentialism. And they try to make this distinction. Now, the funny thing about this is if you paid any attention to the trans debate, the gender ideology debate, and you kind of had to, unfortunately, it was literally like state mandated in our educational and media institutions and even many of our corporate institutions. If you paid attention, there was a shell game that was played here, right? At first, the gender activists said, no, of course we're not talking about biological reality. We're talking about this culturally created identity of gender. That is malleable, not the biological reality. However, the longer this went on and the more that they felt secure in their ability to make this argument, they eventually flipped this, right? The shell game got moved around and they said, oh, actually, no, there is no biological essential agent to gender. Actually, all of that is socially constructed too. Even the scientific understanding of biological sex is itself a social construct, and therefore both biological sex and gender are entirely malleable, right? Now, again, if you have any belief in actual male and female, that can't be true. But we need to acknowledge that that is a biologically essential argument for the reality of sex. And we also need to be honest and say that all gender expressions are themselves a reflection of biological essentialism. You are saying, actually, if there is a real male and there is a real female in a gendered sense, those things are only connected to the biological reality of male and female in the sex sense. And so even though every man and every woman isn't the same, obviously there's wide variations in men and women, and we don't have to necessarily cram everyone into the same box. The majority of men hold a specific disposition, and the majority of women hold a specific disposition. And that is not entirely instructed by culture. There are real biological underlying things that drive us towards this. But I would go another step further, because I'm not a materialist. And I would say that it's not just the biological reality of sex that makes you male or female. There's also a metaphysical aspect that makes you male or female. And that spiritual aspect is just as important to defining the reality that is then reflected in gender expressions, right? So we take this back to our discussion when it comes to national identity. Now, again, I'm not a biological essentialist when it comes to national identity. I don't think that that is a healthy way to understand all nationhood. Again, that will make people on the far right angry. That's fine. I'm just telling you the honest truth. And I think I'm in good company with this. I don't think that, again, many of the perennial traditionalists also would have had this problem. They specifically expressed this problem when it came to just genetic determinism. That said, they would have never said that these things don't have an impact, and I'm not going to say it either, right? That these things do matter, that there is a certain amount of heritage that is critical to national identity, and that rapid change of that heritage makes it impossible to maintain that identity. That if we change too many boards out of the Ship of Theseus too rapidly, we will fundamentally change the identity of the ship, even if we keep the form of the ship. The form itself is not sufficient to maintain the identity. But I'm going to make another argument that's another level down, because I don't think the form itself can actually be maintained sufficiently with rapid change. So, one of the other problems we're facing in the United States, I got some blowback for this on Twitter, right? Kash Patel. Now, I don't know Kash Patel very well. So what I'm going to say here has nothing to do with Kash Patel, the person. I've heard good things about this guy. I've heard that he's the kind of guy that's going to go in there and clean up the FBI. I want to make it clear. If that's true, then he is awesome. I am glad he's on my team. This is in no way an attack on Kash Patel as a person. That said, Kash Patel swore in to his oath as the head of the FBI on a religious book from Hinduism, right? From an Indian book tied to Hinduism. Now, he did this because Kash Patel knows that he has a specific religion and ethnic identity. And he is honoring that religion and that ethnic identity while he is serving in the United States. Now, I would say, personally, I've been told that America is an idea. I don't think America is an idea. But if America is an idea and you're swearing to uphold that idea, you should probably swear on a book that actually formed that idea. And if we actually believe the rhetoric of the propositional nation, that book was not in any way Hindu. Hinduism did nothing to form the United States. Hindu values are not American values. Indian culture is not American culture. That doesn't mean that over a sufficient amount of time, someone from India cannot, after many generations, blend their bloodline and their beliefs into America. However, I pointed out that this was not assimilation, and a lot of people got very angry. And they said, of course it's assimilation. He's got religious liberty. He's got the right to do this, which is not the same as what you should be doing. But he is just expressing these American values of religious liberty, which is another way to say there is no American values, right? Because what I've been told, and this is really critical, this is kind of the core of my argument here, is that I have been told that America is an idea, or it's a proposition that we assent to, and that this proposition is founded in the Christian roots of the United States. A lot of people throw around the term Judeo-Christian. I'm not sure why. These roots are Christian, particularly, right? They're Judaism, a different religion. I imagine if you walked up and told Ben Shapiro he's basically just a Christian, he would disagree with you. And so I'm not sure why we mix those terms. That said, these are very Christian values, right? And that is where these ideas came from. So if you're going to uphold these ideas, at the very least, you would need to have some grounding in these ideas. Now, what a lot of people want to do is they want to abstract the ideas that came from Christianity itself. We want to pull these away and say, you can hold Christian ideas without being Christian. Now, that's certainly true, right? There are cultural Christians. There are people of, let's say, European descent who are not Christian, but live in predominantly Christian cultures and continue to be of those cultures, right? So it's not that there can't be some level of not being entirely bought into the tradition, the religion, and yet still holding a certain degree of those values. That certainly can exist. That said, like the Ship of Theseus, the question becomes, how many people, how many leaders can we replace with Hindus before we have Hindu values instead of American values? If American values, and many people will acknowledge this now, Jordan Peterson ran a whole conference, the whole ARC conference was a bunch of European leaders, saying our values are founded on Christianity. The Christian faith is the foundation of these things. Okay, but how many people can you have who it's not just that they don't believe in Christianity. They actively believe in another faith. They actively believe in another worldview that is not Christianity. Again, there could be great things about Hinduism, but it is not Christianity. These are distinct religions. I want to make it really clear. That Christ is true, is the truth. He is the way. He's the path to salvation and to God, and Hinduism is not. Neither is Islam. Neither is Buddhism. Neither is secular humanism or atheism or Judaism. None of these will get you to the real truth, to heaven, to a relationship with God, to an understanding of Christianity. And so if you actively hold these other religions and you start making up more and more of the leadership class of any given country, can you continue to hold these ideas? Again, probably for a generation or two, right? I'm sure that Kash Patel probably holds American values to a large extent, right? But how many generations of children raised on Hinduism with a primarily ethnic identity of another kind can perpetuate this identity? That's a much more difficult question, and this is the question that we are now really getting into. This is the question that the UK is now getting into when they discuss these issues, right? What is a British identity? If we're just going to say, okay, there's English ethnicity and identity, and that is a specific thing, but then there's like this abstracted British understanding, and that is Welsh, and it's Scottish, and it's Irish, but maybe it's also these other Commonwealth countries, right? That's kind of the implication now, is that it expands out to you could bring in Indians, you could bring in people from other cultures, Canadians, Australians. They would share this culture to some extent. They could come in. How far away can they be? How radically different can their culture be, and them still be able to kind of weave themselves into the Ship of Theseus? How many British people can be another religion, can be another ethnicity that wasn't originally part of the Ship of Theseus and still maintain British identity. That is now the debate that is happening, and the same thing is happening in the United States. Now, again, the key, I think, is change over time. No identity is static over time. That includes national identity. And there will always be changes, right? Just as different peoples in the British Isles blended together to become a more united kingdom, there could be a sense in which you have people further and further outside of that are able to draw it in. But there might also be a hard barrier, right? There might also be hard barriers to this identity. If you are completely unwilling to adopt the religion that gave birth to the values of the society you're trying to integrate into, can you integrate? Can multiple generations holding separate religious beliefs and separate values continue to integrate into British or American values? That's a real question. And again, change over time is key. If you allow for the understanding that membership into a nation is a multi-generational process, that someone, if I was born if I traveled to Japan, I would not expect the people there to call me Japanese, right? I'm clearly not Japanese. I would not expect them to even call my children Japanese, even if they were born in Japan and they primarily spoke Japanese. I would not expect the Japanese to adopt them as their own. No one would. Even the most radical progressives kind of recognize the Japanese would not do this. However, if my children's children are in Japan, many generations have been in Japan. They've intermarried. They've held the religion their entire lives. They've spoken the language their entire lives. This is the only tradition they've ever known, right? 4, 5, 6 generations in, eventually you did end up in a scenario where you would probably be relatively understood as being part of that nation. And the same thing, I think, is true with most ethnic identities, most understandings of nationhood. Over time, these things can change. People can join them. There can be a certain level of actual weaving in. You can maintain the Ship of Theseus, but again, only if you do so very slowly and you respect the boundaries of that. You should not be bringing new people in or radically changing the nation your goal. There's no moral value to that. There's no practical value to that either. There's just no reason to make that the goal of your country, the goal of your nation. See how I just did the interchange? That's how used we are to putting it in our own language. But I think that ultimately there is a way in which we can see these changes over time and they can be natural and these nations can maintain their form. But you cannot make that the central duty of the nation. You cannot make that the central ideology of the nation. And that's what it has become. This radical need for inclusion has decided that we need to speed up this process. We need to speed run this process. The minute someone crosses a border, they automatically are of that nation, right? The minute you walk into Sweden, you're Swedish. The minute you walk into the United States, you're in the United States. Or if you've only been there 5 years, you can just raise your hand and you say something about the ideology and you become that. That is not the way that identity has ever been understood. That's not the way that nationhood has ever been understood. And so we should not make that our ideological modus operandi. That should not be the way we understand our mission as a nation, is to find as many people who are as different as us as possible and integrate them into the whole. There'll be nothing for them to integrate into. Again, I've referenced this book many times, but Samuel Huntington's Who Are We is a great book on this. He points out that Anglo-Protestantism is the core identity of the United States. It doesn't mean that everyone who's in America has to be Anglo or Protestant, but it does mean that if you try to change our core away from Anglo-Protestantism, if you try to make us something else, we will lose something critical about our identity. And so we need to recognize the core of that identity and the danger of changing it rapidly, while also allowing for a certain amount of change over time, recognizing that no nation is entirely static, no tradition, unless it's dead, is entirely the same throughout different generations. And so from generation to generation, we will add and we will make certain changes. However, if we want to have a continuity of civilization, a continuity of nationhood, we need to slow that pace of change very much, way more than we are doing right now. Because if we don't, this destroys national identity. It destroys identity, period. It destroys social cohesion and the ability to function as a nation. And that's what we're seeing around the world today. All right, guys, I'm going to go take a look at the questions of the people real quick. Gabby of Limburg says, OGC NYC chapter in the making, come. Oh, okay, so you guys are putting together an Old Glory Club chapter in New York. That's excellent. A very liberal place, so I'm sure the people there very much need the kind of structure that the OGC provides. If you guys are unfamiliar with the Old Glory Club, make sure to check them out. It's a great fraternal organization that is trying to grapple with protecting and helping the American national identity, helping Americans grow that cultural power, that local organization that allows you to be reliant, find brotherhood, find people that you can count on that aren't necessarily tied to the government. You're not entirely reliant on the state. Thumplar says, they say we are a propositional nation, but then they admit that the left has different propositions, but are somehow still the same nation. It's a weasel word, too. You can just change the proposition. You can't change ethnos. Yeah, again, I've made this argument when it comes to my essay against the propositional nation. I agree with you that this is often something people say out loud. I'm a propositional nation, but they never follow the implications of that. That's why they don't try to denaturalize someone like Ilhan Omar. She continues to serve as a representative in Congress, even though she obviously hates the United States, never integrated, does not respect the propositions, yet the propositional nation will not expel her. That means you just aren't a propositional nation. Creeper Weirdo says, not to get off topic, but did you see AA's video about putting the woke away? It's actually very good, and the critique of the war of faith meme is interesting and worth engaging in. I started it. I gotta say, I love AA, but his hatred of America is wearing pretty thin. I didn't finish it, honestly, because I was so off-put by the just kind of how negative it was towards kind of Americans. I'll give it another go. Maybe he does get to the argument and it's good. Other people have said that. It just, I feel for what's happening in the UK. I don't blame every person in the UK for it. It's kind of strange that AA doesn't like what's going on in the United States, but he blames every American for it. It just doesn't seem to jive. And then we have Guildhelm says, related concept worth investigating is Sumner's folkways, habitual usage, manners, customs, morals, which through clearly biological in origin aren't static. Albion seed is great for this too. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular coinage. Well, I've heard of folkways, of course, but I don't know who Sumner is, and so I can't say that I know the usage there. That said, yeah, you can see this, and this is I'm reading Heidegger right now. Heidegger acknowledges that this is part of different peoples have these emergent understandings. Just something as basic as how close you should be standing towards each other when you're talking. That understanding is very different. If you get a bunch of North Africans and a bunch of Europeans in the same room, they're going to all be trying to adjust their distance to each other because the Europeans want to stand further apart. The North Africans want to stand closer together in order to have conversations that kind of have very different understandings of personal space. And that's just a small example of kind of the way that no one came by and said, we all stand 6 feet apart. The British stand 6 feet apart and the North Africans stand 3 feet apart. And that's what makes you British or North African, right? Like there was no decree about this. And yet we do it naturally. We have these cultural norms that we adopt, even though we don't understand it. The manners, the customs, the habituated usages you're talking about here. These are all things that are emergent properties. They are also obviously tied to our heritage, but one can learn them differently. If you've been, again, a part of a culture for a long time, several generations, you probably adopt them without even noticing. And so the idea that they're entirely biological is probably incorrect. So it's this, things that are tied in some sense to biological reality, but are also things that change over time and influenced by culture, can be adopted and shifted over time. So it sounds like those are similar ideas there. Let's see here. Super Joe's Midlife Crisis says, Auron, what part of the FBI is in keeping with American Christian values in the first place? And yes, AA's anti-Americanism is getting old. I can't say that there's much about the FBI that is positive at this point. I'm sure there's some need for law enforcement coordination between different states, but most states have a law enforcement agency that mimics the FBI, that kind of does a lot of the same work. We could probably decentralize a vast amount of that and not lose anything significant. Skeptical Panda says, in modern America, it seems they're simply trying to steal and sell the boards of the ship one at a time. Yes, and I think that's ultimately what happens when you try to change the Ship of Theseus too rapidly. No one values it anymore, right? At this point, we have a bunch of elites who don't have any of these American values that we're supposed to have, and because they're not grounded in any of the aspects of shared national identity at this point. And so they're willing to sell every aspect of the nation, all of the boards of the Ship of Theseus. Let's see here. Johan Richardson said, even mid-century Germans officially accepted half-heritage folks who lived as Germans. By the way, yeah, that includes Jews, funny enough. Leni Riefenstahl also was an artistic authority rather than forced into a motherhood program. Always some flex. Yeah, again, this is just even the most dedicated race scientists in history didn't have this complete understanding, or at least they didn't practice it in a lot of scenarios. And I just think the people who get like what I guess what you would call full race realist are missing something critical about national identity, but people who entirely ignore some level of biological heritage are themselves missing. And I think both camps are too simplistic, and this will make both of them angry at me, and you'll probably see both of them yell at me about this episode, but who cares? I'm just trying to talk about the truth. I'm not cutting a middle way because it makes me super rational and the centrist position is always the best position. I'm just cutting that path because I think it's true, and I think it aligns with most of the evidence that we see throughout history and sociology. Robert Weinsfeld says, maybe pedantic here, but don't you need to be a Christian to be American? If you don't want America to be Christian, you don't belong here. J friend. I guess probably Jewish friend. So again, I think that it's possible to probably maintain another faith and still be Christian, or rather still be American on some level. However, there's a percentage problem here, right? You could have small doses of that in the United States and still have America in general be an identity. But if the majority of America became Hindu tomorrow, or Jewish tomorrow, or Muslim tomorrow, it would radically change. And we would know this when it comes to Islam. No one has a problem recognizing that if we move, the entirety of Iran to the United States tomorrow, and we started allowing all these people who have that religious belief into high positions of power, we would fundamentally change our legal structure. We would see probably more Sharia law and all this stuff, right? No one has a problem admitting that when it comes to Islam. However, there seems to be some problem admitting it when it comes to other religions. Now, I'm the first to recognize that Islam is probably more hostile to American values than maybe some other religions, but those religions are still distinct and different religions. They still have distinct and different values. Otherwise, people wouldn't have continued to be Jewish or Hindu. They would just become Christians. So there must be something distinct about those religions that means they have a separate identity and value. Now, again, there's probably a certain percentage of the country, that can probably be, governed by the state as we understand it, of a different religion and still maintain our kind of national identity as Anglo-Protestant. Just like there's probably a certain level of other people from other countries that can come in and you still maintain it. But it's relatively small and it has to be changed over time. You can't dump the entire contents of the Middle East into the United States or Israel and expect them to stay the same, which is why they won't let that happen to Israel. But for some reason, we're acting like we can do that in the United States. We can't. The same principles apply. You can't bring a large amount of people from a different religion, a different background, a different tradition, and expect everything to stay the same. And so I don't think that every single person who crosses into the United States and wants to be part of the United States has to become Christian. I think you should, 100%, but I don't know if that has to be a final test of Americanism. However, we should recognize that if we're bringing in a high percentage of people who aren't Christian, eventually we have to change the underlying values of the nation. You can't tell me that America is built on Christian values and then have everybody be a different religion. That's just not how that works. If you have abstracted American identity to the point where you think you can take all the Christianity out of Christianity and still have it be American, then you're completely destroying the very argument of identity that you're putting forward. It's no more artificial, or rather it is as artificial as the progressive identity that says, oh, you can just change your gender at any moment, right? No, you can't. And you can't just change your religion at any moment. You can't just change your values at any moment. There are changes. People can convert to Christianity, but that requires a whole life change, right? It's not a simple, oh, well, I'll just slap this new bumper sticker on and keep living the same lifestyle. If you've done that, then you aren't Christian. That's a specific doctrine of Christianity. You'll be known by your fruits. The fact that you change your lifestyle, you change your approach, you change your values is what makes you Christian. And so there has to be a certain level of walk and talk aligned with each other. The same has to be true with American identity. You can't just come in here and say, oh, well, I'm going to keep my religion. I'm going to keep my ethnic identity. I'm going to keep my language, but I'm American. No, that can't be the case. There has to be some level of change if you're going to actually be weaving yourself into this whole, if you're going to be a part of the Ship of Theseus. Bloodbase says, powerful and thought-provoking content lately. Salute. Well, thank you very much, man. I hope so. Again, I'm always putting this together. This is how I understand it. I hope that it helps people make sense. Obviously, I'm willing to talk about these issues. I'm doing it to some extent. Obviously, I've prepared this talk, but I'm also talking off the cuff here. So I'm not getting everything right. I'm sure I'm going to have to think over these issues more. I'm trying to write a book about this now, or at least partially about this as well. So, these are ideas that I'm knocking around. Maybe, parts of this will change as I explore these concepts in more detail and try to get a firmer grasp. But I hope that's why you guys come by, right? Because we're doing this live, right? You could always just go read a book on this. I think the reason that people listen and want to be part of these conversations is they recognize that they are conversations. These are things that are being formed in real time. We're all trying to understand this together. Sometimes we'll be wrong, but hopefully we're moving towards a better understanding. And I think that's part of what people want to be a part of when they kind of listen in. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for coming by. As always, if it's your first time on this channel, you need to go ahead and subscribe. Click on the YouTube bell, all that stuff, so that get the notifications when we're going live with the streams. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. If you'd like to get my book, The Total State, then you need to do that by going to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or you can probably order it through your favorite local bookstore. Thank you everybody for watching again. And as always, I will talk to you next time.